everybody, and welcome to another episode of Aatif Rashid's Book Club. I'm Aatif Rashid, and today we're going to be discussing Jack Kerouac's On the Road from 1957. So this is a wonderful novel, a classic of what's called the Beat generation of writers. For me, I love this novel for a lot of reasons, but mainly because of the language. As we're going to see today, we're going to look at a bunch of passages. Jack Kerouac's sentences are like no one else. He writes with a certain freedom, liberation, a kind of mystical beauty at times. People have often compared Kerouac to Whitman in his love of America, in his desire for this deeper freedom that so many people crave. I think you could take it even further back. On the Road is in some ways part of a trajectory that can go all the way back to kind of religious mystics of the past. I use that word intentionally because there is something very mystical about Jack Kerouac's writing, about the journey that Sal and Dean undertake. They are American mystics of the 50s, seeking a kind of individual liberation from the conformity of the world. I think that's the context that's essential to understand why this novel resonates so much and why it's so meaningful, right? It's written at a time when the country, after World War II, was experiencing this level of prosperity, of wealth, but also this conformity. We don't have to get too much into the social situation of America in the 1950s, but just remember that Kerouac was reacting against the culture of the time. This novel is often associated with the 1960s, but it's actually a little bit earlier. You can see, though, the seeds of the 1960s counterculture in this novel, in some of the values that its characters embody. I think, though, the joy of this novel just comes from the experience of reading it, of indulging in Kerouac sentences, and in connecting to his protagonist. Because that's the other reason I think this novel is so universally beloved and continues to be read over 50 years after it was published. And that's because there is something universal about our protagonist, Sal, and what he desires. And I think what's so moving is it's what so many of us desire. This burning need for a kind of individual freedom from the world. And I think what makes On the Road so vivid and so compelling is Kerouac is wise enough to keep this desire of Sal's relatively abstract and undefined. We're going to look at passages throughout the novel that highlight and describe kind of what he's feeling, what he wants. But at its core, it's something that approaches the universal, some deeper desire for a kind of spiritual freedom rather than just a sort of literal freedom. And I think it's that spiritual dimension that makes this novel universal, that makes it resonate with people no matter what time period you live in. And even if you feel like you don't really connect to the characters' actual lives, like maybe you feel reading this. I know a lot of people sometimes when they read this novel, they kind of bristle at the maleness of the novel. Sal is a man, Jack Kerouac is a man, Dean is a man. There aren't that many women in the novel, and the women, Sal doesn't really seem that interested in the women, right? As we're going to see, he's mainly interested in Dean. But I think this is one of those cases where it doesn't really matter what your race is or what your gender is or what your sexual orientation is or anything about your life. What you have to, I think, and this is true for a lot of novels, what you have to do as a reader is be able to let all the things about your life go. Let all the details about your life go and try and connect on a more spiritual level with your character's desires, right? With what they are hoping to achieve. In this case, I think that's very easy to do because, as we're going to see, Kerouac imbues Sal's desire to get on the road, to travel, with such spiritual meaning and such spiritual stakes. This is something we talk about all the time in my creative writing classes, the idea of stakes. Why does it matter? Why are we reading this? Why do we care? Why is it important? When we read On the Road, we never question that. We never ask why it matters or why we're reading this or why we care, because it's so obvious, right? It's so obvious as we read it that Sal wants the same thing that we all want. for life to mean something more than just the practicalities and the external details, for life to have a spiritual meaning. And that's what he seeks as he and Dean and all these characters, crisscross America. And for them, I think the road represents that path to freedom. So the novel is basically structured around several different road trips, right, that Sal and Dean and a bunch of other characters take all over America and at one point down to Mexico. But let's start at the very beginning, because I think the opening paragraph really sets the mood and gets us into the rhythms of Kerouac's prose. And of course introduces us to, the key characters and the key conflicts. So let's take a look at this opening paragraph. I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up. I had just gotten over a serious illness that I won't bother to talk about, except that it had something to do with the miserably weary split up, and my feeling that everything was dead. With the coming of Dean Moriarty began the part of my life you could call my life on the road. Before that, I'd often dreamed of going west to see the country, always vaguely planning and never taking off. Dean is the perfect guy for the road because he actually was born on the road when his parents were passing through Salt Lake City in 1926 in a jalopy on their way to Los Angeles. First reports of him came to me through Chad King, who'd shown me a few letters from him written in a New Mexico reform school. I was tremendously interested in the letters because they so naively and sweetly asked Chad to teach him all about Nietzsche and all the wonderful intellectual things that Chad knew. At one point, Carlo and I talked about the letters and wondered if we would ever meet the strange Dean Moriarty. This is all far back, when Dean was not the way he is today, when he was a young jail kid shrouded in mystery. Then news came that Dean was out of reform school and was coming to New York for the first time. Also, there was talk that he had just married a girl called Mary Lou. So what we have there is an introduction to Sal, but more specifically an introduction to Dean, right? Who's going to be kind of the muse, essentially, right? This young man who, certainly there's a lot of homoerotic tension here, right? In the way Kerouac has Sal write about Dean. But more than that, I think Dean is a symbol of the kind of earnest American freedom that Sal seems to really crave. Look at the way he writes this opening line. I first met Dean not long after my wife and I split up. So he's right away basically contrasting Dean with his wife. He's essentially saying Dean became this replacement for his wife, right? He gets divorced, and then he meets Dean, and Dean sort of, fills the hole, so to speak. We don't really learn much about Sal's wife in this. She's not even that important. What's important is Dean. He becomes the figure who represents all the things that Sal desires, all the things that Sal is craving. Now, I think the key here in this paragraph is that Sal first learns about Dean and kind of meets Dean through his letters. That's going to be really important because Dean is a talker, right? Dean is someone who has a voice. Dean is someone who speaks a lot. And it's that voice and it's that talkiness, right? It's that exuberance that Sal is so drawn to. Language is so important in this novel. And you also can hear it in the way Kerouac writes, right? With this kind of free, loose style, conversational to some extent, but also dreamy and lyrical. The kind of long sentences, the nice up and down rhythms. We're going to look at more sentences than just this. But I wanted to read that opening just to emphasize kind of some of the key themes that Kerouac sets up right away, right at the beginning. A few other sections from this opening chapter that I want to emphasize. Let's take a look at a few paragraphs down where he first meets Dean in person. I went to the Coldwater flat with the boys, and Dean came to the door in his shorts. Mary Lou was jumping off the couch. Dean had dispatched the occupant of the apartment to the kitchen, probably to make coffee, while he proceeded with his love problems, for to him, sex was the one and only holy and important thing in life, although he had to sweat and curse to make a living, and so on. So it's funny that the first thing that's emphasized about Dean is sex, right? Now, Dean is going to have sex with several different women over the course of this story, right? Women are very important to Dean. He's going to end up in entanglements with women, including Mary Lou, who we meet here. But I think it also emphasizes implicitly the sex appeal that Dean has for Sal, right, for our narrator. I wouldn't say Sal is explicitly gay, but there is definitely something homoerotic about his friendship with Dean. I'm going to call it a friendship, though, because I think behind the sex appeal, right, there is kind of a deeper spiritual connection that he and Dean share that basically animates and drives this novel. It's not about the physical side, right? This is a novel about spirituality, right? About the spiritual sustenance that life can give you. But I think it's important to note how physical Dean is, how he's a person full of energy. If we keep reading, you saw that in the way he stood bobbing his head and always looking down, nodding, like a young boxer to instructions, to make you think he was listening to every word, throwing in 1,000 yeses and that's rights. My first impression of Dean was of a young Gene Autry, trim, thin-hipped, blue-eyed, with a real Oklahoma accent, a sideburn hero of the snowy West. In fact, he'd just been working on a ranch at Walls in Colorado before marrying Mary Lou and coming east. So the emphasis here is on the West. And maybe it's a little hard for us to understand today when the West, California, is in many ways not nearly as magical, right, as it used to be in the cultural imagination of people from the East Coast. But back then, right, the West still had this kind of magical, almost underdeveloped quality. The Sun Belt hadn't really been settled in the way it had in the late 20th century. And so the West still retained some of the innocence of the American frontier, I think. And we're going to see that a lot in this novel. And Dean, what's important here is Dean represents the West. Sal is from the East Coast. Sal is from New Jersey. But Dean represents the West. And again, that's part of the draw for Sal, right? Dean, to him, is somehow more authentically American because he comes from the West, because he has this frontier spirit in him. So, jumping to the end of this chapter, I want to just look at how it concludes, because I think this chapter does a really good job of setting up, like I said earlier, Sal's motivation, Sal's desire as a character. His desire to sort of connect with Dean. So, let's take a look at the paragraph towards the end of the chapter that starts with, yes, and it wasn't only. Yes, and it wasn't only because I was a writer and needed new experiences that I wanted to know Dean more, and because my life hanging around the campus had reached the completion of its cycle and was stultified, but because, somehow in spite of our difference in character, he reminded me of some long-lost brother. The sight of his suffering bony face with the long sideburns, and his straining muscular sweating neck made me remember my boyhood in those dye dumps and swim holes and riversides of Patterson and the Passaic. His dirty work clothes clung to him so gracefully, as though you couldn't buy a better fit from a custom tailor, but only earn it from the natural tailor of natural joy, as Dean had in his stresses. And in his excited way of speaking, I heard again the voices of old companions and brothers under the bridge, among the motorcycles, along the wash-line neighborhood and drowsy doorsteps of afternoon, where boys played guitars while their older brothers worked in the mills. So he's emphasizing that Dean reminds him of some long-lost brother, and he conjures up these memories from childhood. I want to also just notice the way Kerouac is writing these sentences. Long, what we call cumulative sentences, which are sometimes also called loose sentences. I like that word here, loose, because I think it describes Kerouac's writing style in general. It's very shaggy and it's very loose. It's not constrained and it's not always technically grammatically correct. He will use a lot of run-on sentences and flowing phrases because he's trying to capture a spirit that is a spirit and an energy that is flowing through his character that Dean is evoking in him. We're going to see even more long and flowing and crazy sentences as the novel goes on. But we already start to see it even a little bit here, these long lists of details and descriptions. I think it's a beautiful and mesmerizing way to write, and I think that is the true joy of this novel, just getting lost in the language, getting lost in the sentences. If we keep reading, all my other current friends were intellectuals. Chad, the Nietzschean anthropologist, Karl Marx and his nutty, surrealist, low-voiced, serious, staring talk, old Bull Lee and his critical, anti-everything drawl. Or else they were slinking criminals like Elmer Hassel with that hip sneer. Jane Lee the same, sprawled on the oriental cover of her couch, sniffing at the New Yorker. But Dean's intelligence was every bit as formal and shining and complete, without the tedious intellectualness. And his criminality was not something that sulked and sneered. It was a wild, yea-saying overburst of American joy. It was Western, the west wind, an ode from the plains, something new, long prophesied, long a-coming. He only stole cars for joyrides. Besides, all my New York friends were in the negative, nightmare position of putting down society and giving their tired, bookish, or political or psychoanalytical reasons. But Dean just raced in society, eager for bread and love. He didn't care one way or the other, so long as I can get that little old gal with that little something down there between her legs, boy. And so long as we can eat, son, you hear me? I'm hungry, I'm starving, let's eat right now. And off we'd rush to eat, whereof, as saith Ecclesiastes, it is your portion under the sun. So what a great sentence, what a great, beautiful, long, flowing sentence that, again, in its rhythms and in its grammar, captures the feeling that Dean is stirring in our narrator. Now notice the contrast in that whole section. He's contrasting his intellectual friends in New Jersey. He's contrasting the intellectuals he knows, and he lists a bunch of them. And many of these are famous figures from the Beat generation. Carlo Marx, I believe, is Allen Ginsberg. Old Bull Lee is William S. Burroughs, etc. That's not too important to me. I'm not interested, again, in the real-world connections here. I'm interested in the language and in the writing itself here, right, in the novel itself. But he's contrasting all these people with Dean. And notice the things, the words he uses to emphasize what Dean is. This is a great phrase, a wild, yea-saying overburst of American joy. Overburst is a great word, and then American is, I think, really key. Once again, he's linking Dean to a kind of authentic, optimistic Americanness that he feels his intellectual friends, with their pessimism and their over-analytical brains, have lost, right? Dean represents a kind of innocent boyhood, our narrator's innocent boyhood, but also America's innocent boyhood. I think you can kind of track, when Saul talks about his own childhood and talks about how Dean reminded him of something from his childhood, implicitly, he's also suggesting that Dean is associated with a certain American childhood, if that makes sense. The last two paragraphs here at the end of this chapter. A Western kinsman of the sun, Dean. Although my aunt warned me that he would get me in trouble, I could hear a new call and see a new horizon, and believe it at my young age. And a little bit of trouble, or even Dean's eventual rejection of me as a buddy, putting me down, as he would later, on starving sidewalks and sickbeds. What did it matter? I was a young writer, and I wanted to take off. Somewhere along the line, I knew there'd be girls, visions, everything. Somewhere along the line, the pearl would be handed to me. So, a few things with those last two paragraphs. First of all, he does foreshadow and kind of tell us how the novel's going to end. Dean will eventually reject him as a buddy, and we're going to look at that scene towards the end. He's telling us right up front that his friendship with Dean is not going to last, that Dean is eventually going to reject him. But I think what's key here is he says it doesn't matter, right? That even though he knows now that Dean will reject him, it doesn't stop him from really falling for Dean, right, in this way, for really being taken by what Dean represents. And this line at the end, I think, is a great just summary of our narrator's deeper desires, right? He says, he knew there'd be girls, visions, everything. But more specifically, he says the pearl would be handed to him. So what is the pearl? It's a biblical reference. And it's a cautionary tale in the Bible, right? The idea of this pearl that you sell everything for. So I think Sal seems to be aware of all he's giving up, right, for Dean and for what Dean represents. But it's also such an optimistic line. It's as if he's saying he knew it would cost him everything and he didn't care. He wanted it. He would pursue it. And again, I think that's what's so magical about this novel, right? The way it captures the drive that people feel, right, for finding something deeper. And I think that's what the pearl represents here for Kerouac, and for Sal. So one other paragraph I just want to look at from this opening chapter, this is maybe the most famous passage from On the Road, the one that gets quoted the most, right, is the passage where he talks about the mad ones. So let's look at this. This is actually earlier than what I just quoted, right? It's in the first chapter. It's kind of in the middle of a long paragraph, in the middle of the chapter that starts with, "We went to New York." And Sal is kind of describing the kinds of people he loves, the kind of people he wants to be around and be a part of. "But then they danced down the streets like dingle-doties, and I shambled after, as I've been doing all my life, after people who interest me. Because the only people for me are the mad ones. The ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time. The ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles exploding like spiders across the stars. And in the middle you see the blue center light pop, and everybody goes, aw." So a lot of times people truncate that quote. They kind of end it with the word candles. That's sacrilege. You can't truncate that quote. The point of the quote is the excess of it, the way it just goes and goes and goes. I mean, it's, as people have noted, it's a depiction of an orgasm, which again associates a certain sexual energy, right, with Sal and with Dean. But more than that, right, I think it represents the kind of spiritual kind of fulfillment in a way. This burst of spiritual fulfillment that Sal seems to be seeking. And in a way, it comes in the first chapter, and I think it previews essentially what he's going to try and find in the course of his journeys, the kind of essential soul of life, right, that he's going to be looking for with Dean. And we're going to see, right, and kind of judge whether he finds it or not at the end of the novel. So much of the middle of the novel is made up of his various road trips, right? The different kinds of people he meets, the people he and Dean encounters, right? Friends, women, relationships, random people on the road hitchhiking. It's a wonderful kind of experience to just read the novel and get lost in it. We're not going to quote a ton from the middle. There's so many passages we could pick out to highlight Kerouac's beautiful writing. The one passage I do want to focus on is actually in chapter 3, kind of towards the middle. And so this is when Sal has basically taken off for his first road trip to go try and meet Dean out in the West. And he's basically hitchhiking his way across the country. This paragraph occurs kind of in the middle of the chapter when he's in Des Moines, Iowa. And he basically gets a room at a hotel. And there's this wonderful depiction of, Des Moines right in the center of the country, right in the middle of the country. And Sal sort of reflects on his own progress through life. And it's a great passage that I think really gets at Sal's sense that this trip is about more than just a trip, that it's a pivotal moment in his own life. So let's just take a look at this, paragraph. "I woke up as the sun was reddening. And that was the one distinct time in my life, the strangest moment of all, when I didn't know who I was. I was far away from home, haunted and tired with travel, in a cheap hotel room I'd never seen, hearing the hiss of steam outside and the creak of the old wood of the hotel and footsteps upstairs and all the sad sounds, and I looked at the cracked ceiling and really didn't know who I was for about 15 strange seconds. I wasn't scared. I was just somebody else, some stranger, and my whole life was a haunted life, the life of a ghost. I was halfway across America, at the dividing line between the east of my youth and the west of my future, and maybe that's why it happened right there and then, that strange red afternoon." So, a great little passage that I think gets at, well, a few things, right? On the one hand, just notice the way Kerouac writes, again, beautiful sensory detail. You'll hear me talk about sensory detail a lot on this podcast. I think I say this in my creative writing classes all the time. It's one of the most essential qualities of a great fiction writer, of a great writer, is to be able to capture sensory experience. Because you're not just telling a story. that happened to someone. You are trying to embody for your reader the experience of going through that moment. And that's another reason why a novel like On the Road resonates so well, is that when we read it, we feel like we are with Sal on the road. We feel like we are in these cars, in these trucks, hitchhiking. In this brilliant scene, he brings us right into this hotel room in Des Moines. Notice the sensory details he uses, the hiss of steam outside, the creak of the old wood of the hotel, and the footsteps upstairs, right? The crack in the ceiling that he notices. You know, earlier in the paragraph, the section I didn't read, he has all kinds of other sensory details, right? The big, clean, hard white bed, the yellow window shades, the smoky scene of the rail yards. He's really good at evoking, with these picturesque details, the experience of making this kind of journey. And that's the real reason why it resonates so much. I think a lot of people try really hard to kind of tell stories like this. They try and talk about trips they've taken. And the trips are obviously so meaningful. But what people forget is that it's only meaningful if you can make the reader feel like they are also taking the trip as you're telling it. If you just summarize a travel experience, it's not very resonant. But if you can do what Kerouac is doing here, and what so many great writers do with sensory detail, you can make the reader feel the emotional significance of the journey that you took. So one section I want to look at in the middle, again, we think about the tension, right? The tension of this novel, as we've said, is about Sal's desire for this transcendence, for this pearl. There's a moment towards the middle, at the end of part 2, when Sal seems to think that he's found what he's looking for. So this is the end of chapter 10 in part 2, right towards the end. So it's a long paragraph, but I want to look kind of in the middle of the paragraph where he says, "And for just a moment. And for just a moment I had reached the point of ecstasy that I always wanted to reach, which was the complete step across chronological time into timeless shadows, and wonderment in the bleakness of the mortal realm, and the sensation of death kicking at my heels to move on, with a phantom dogging its own heels, and myself hurrying to a plank where all the angels dove off and flew into the holy void of uncreated emptiness, the potent and inconceivable radiances shining in bright mind essence, innumerable lotus lands falling open in the magic moth swarm of heaven." So let's break down that sentence, because that is a mesmerizing sentence. The idea here is that he's describing having reached that point of ecstasy that he has been dreaming of, that he has been desiring. And how does he describe it? He says it is a step across chronological time into timeless shadows. So again, this is where the mystic aspect of this novel comes in. This description of having achieved the spiritual ideal, the spiritual everything that he's been dreaming of and desiring. First, it involves stepping outside or beyond chronological time. And what does he say? He feels a wonderment in the bleakness of the mortal realm. He seems to sort of realize the reality of death and say there's something almost wondrous about this realization. And he feels the sensation of death at his own heels, right? And he's hurrying to a plank where the angels dove off and flew into the holy void. He feels like he is one of these angels leaping off a plank into this holy void of uncreated emptiness. I mean, I think this is, in many ways, what in kind of earlier writings, the Buddhists would have described as the nirvana, right? The spiritual enlightenment that so many of them were seeking, kind of embracing the void and the emptiness. And what does he say? It's like innumerable lotus lands falling open in the magic moth swarm of heaven. He's kind of mixing different spiritual references, Greek mythology, traditional Christian ideals of heaven, right? Buddhist ideals of enlightenment, into this kind of American mysticism. If we keep reading, I could hear an indescribable seething roar, which wasn't in my ear, but everywhere, and had nothing to do with sounds. I realized that I had died and been reborn numberless times, but just didn't remember especially, because the transitions from life to death and back to life are so ghostly easy, a magical action for naught, like falling asleep and waking up again a million times, the utter casualness and deep ignorance of it. I realized it was only because of the stability of the intrinsic mind that these ripples of birth and death took place, like the action of wind on a sheet of pure, serene, mirror-like water. I felt sweet, swinging bliss, like a big shot of heroin in the mainline vein, like a gulp of wine late in the afternoon, and it makes you shudder. My feet tingled. I thought I was going to die the very next moment. But I didn't die, and walked 4 miles, and picked up 10 long butts, and took them back to Mary Lou's hotel room, and poured their tobacco in my old pipe and lit up. I was too young to know what had happened. So then he sort of concludes this passage with a long description of San Francisco and the different foods, right, that are available. And I love that passage. We're not going to read the whole thing, but I like that because it's sort of like he's re-embracing life after having experienced this moment of spiritual death and rebirth. I think that's key because, if this is a novel about Sal trying to achieve, right, what he feels that Dean has, Sal trying to grasp this new way of living, right, this more open, free, and honest, and earnest, and optimistic way of living, then what we see here is the essential kind of death and rebirth, right, into this new way of living. Now, obviously, this is only part 2. The novel's not going to end here, and the tension is going to be, can Sal really find and achieve that thing that Dean represents? Can he still get that pearl? And the kind of tension of the novel, right, is will Sal find this mystic transcendence that he's been seeking? Will Sal actually come to understand? That's kind of the driving tension of the novel, the kind of underlying tension beneath, right, the external antics that happen in the novel. And there's this one passage where he seems to reflect on this question and think about almost the impossibility of achieving this, or at least that's what he seems to think at this moment. So part 3 of the novel, chapter 3, towards the end. It was the saddest night. I felt as if I was with strange brothers and sisters in a pitiful dream. Then a complete silence fell over everybody. Where once Dean would have talked his way out, he now fell silent himself. But standing in front of everybody, ragged and broken and idiotic, right under the light bulbs, his bony, mad face covered with sweat and throbbing veins, saying, "Yes, yes, yes," as though tremendous revelations were pouring into him all the time now. And I am convinced they were, and the others suspected as much and were frightened. He was beat, the root, the soul of beatific. What was he knowing? He tried all in his power to tell me what he was knowing, and they envied that about me, my position at his side, defending him and drinking him in as they once tried to do. Then they looked at me. What was I, a stranger, doing on the West Coast this fair night? I recoiled from the thought. So that's the passage where Sal kind of gives us the idea of beat, right, from the root beatific, the beat generation. That's where he really defines that term and associates it with Dean. But I think what's key about that is Sal is sort of saying, like, Dean seems to be full of these revelations. And that's the word he uses. Tremendous revelations were pouring into him. And he asks the question, what was he knowing? In other words, what did Dean know? He has this sense that Dean has the answer, right? He has the answer to life's big questions. And yet he can't share that, right? He can't tell other people what he knows. This, I think, is the great tension at the heart of this novel, what gives the novel its drive. If Dean represents this kind of authentic, innocent, wild, mystic America that Sal wants to know, Sal is like the rest of us. Sal wants to understand what Dean seems to know intuitively. And yet I think the tension here is that Sal is not sure if he actually can understand it. Sal feels in this moment like it's just beyond his understanding, that Dean actually is unable to share what he knows. And I think, again, think of the image of the pearl at the end of the first chapter. Sal had said that he wants the pearl, right? He wants the pearl to be handed to him. Here, it's almost like he's saying, yeah, Dean has the pearl, but he can't share it. He can't share what the pearl means. And perhaps Sal wonders if it's going to be that way forever, if he's never really going to get that pearl. Now, I think the key moment of the novel, the key moment where he basically experiences and finally achieves what he's looking for, what I think is the climactic point of this book, is when they get to Mexico City. And they finally seem to have found, not in America, which is important, but outside of America, that feeling of transcendence, right, that they were seeking. So let's look at this passage that's set in Mexico City. So this is in part 4 of the novel, and it's a long chapter, right? It's chapter 6. So part 4, chapter 6, towards the end, basically. So it's a paragraph that begins in downtown Mexico City. And again, I think this is the climax of the novel. So let's read it, and as we read it, let's think about how it represents the climax, how it represents Sal and Dean having achieved what they had sought out from the very beginning, that pearl that Sal described. In downtown Mexico City, thousands of hipsters in floppy straw hats and long lapelled jackets over bare chests padded along the main drag, some of them selling crucifixes and weed in the alleys, some of them kneeling in beat chapels next to Mexican burlesque shows in sheds. Some alleys were rubble, with open sewers, and little doors led to closet-sized bars stuck in adobe walls. You had to jump over a ditch to get your drink, and in the bottom of the ditch was the ancient lake of the Aztec. You came out of the bar with your back to the wall and edged back to the street. They served coffee mixed with rum and nutmeg. Mambo blared from everywhere. Hundreds of whores lined themselves along the dark and narrow streets, and their soulful eyes gleamed at us in the night. We wandered in a frenzy and a dream. We ate beautiful steaks for 48 cents in a strange, tiled Mexican cafeteria with generations of marimba musicians standing at one immense marimba, also wandering, singing guitarists and old men on corners blowing trumpets. You went by the sour stink of pulque saloons. They gave you a water glass of cactus juice in there, 2 cents. Nothing stopped. The streets were alive all night. Beggars slept wrapped in advertising posters torn off fences. Whole families of them sat on the sidewalk, playing little flutes and chuckling in the night. Their bare feet stuck out, their dim candles burned. All Mexico was one vast bohemian camp. On corners, old women cut up the boiled heads of cows and wrapped morsels in tortillas and served them with hot sauce on newspaper napkins. This was the great and final, wild, uninhibited, fellahin, childlike city that we knew we would find at the end of the road. Dean walked through with his arms hanging zombie-like at his sides, his mouth open, his eyes gleaming, and conducted a ragged and holy tour that lasted till dawn in a field with a boy in a straw hat who laughed and chatted with us and wanted to play catch. For nothing ever ended. All right, so let's pause there. I want to analyze it. I wanted to read that whole paragraph, that whole scene uninterrupted, because it's, again, part of the joy of Kerouac is reading these long flowing sentences and paragraphs and kind of just letting it all wash over you, letting the experience of the sentences mimic for us the experience of Sal and Dean. But there's so much there to analyze. I think the things to focus on is, obviously, there's that key line, right? All Mexico was one vast bohemian camp. The idea is, they look at this image of Mexico, and to some people it might seem like an image of destitution, right? Of poverty, especially with those details of families sitting on the sidewalk, beggars wrapped in advertising posters. But Sal is at the point in his journey that to him, these beggars represent the ultimate form of freedom. Freedom from everything, right? Their bare feet, their dim candles. And notice all of the sort of the glory of this place, the glory of Mexico. For him, Mexico is the apotheosis. Mexico City here, downtown Mexico City, is the apotheosis of what he and Dean had been seeking in America. One vast bohemian camp. What is he, and this is the key line right here, this was the great and final, wild, uninhibited, fellahin, childlike city that we knew we would find at the end of the road. What I love about that sentence is, first of all, there are no commas to separate the adjectives. He lets the adjectives just rush through the sentence. Great and final, wild, uninhibited, fellahin, childlike city. Just the flow of descriptions that sort of convey the overwhelming glory that he seems to feel at having found it finally, at having found the thing he was seeking. And Kerouac is not necessarily subtle here. He literally says, this is the end of the road. This is what they were seeking. This beautiful bohemian camp, this fellahin, childlike city. This was the pearl. This is what they were searching for, and they found it. And notice Dean's reaction. Dean walked through with his arms hanging zombie-like at his sides, his mouth open, his eyes gleaming. I think it's kind of key that Dean, who is such a talker for most of the novel, who has so much to say, when they do finally reach it, he's a zombie-like. His arms are hanging at his side, his mouth is open, his eyes are gleaming. It's like he too, like Sal, is overwhelmed by what they've found. And so I think this is the great climactic point of the novel. Let's think about why it's set in Mexico City. I think that's really telling. What I think Kerouac is suggesting or implying here is that America in the 50s is too corrupt, is too commodified, is too stultified, is too conformist to have this anymore. The idea is that maybe once America was like this, but now it's no longer like this, and they sought this all over America and couldn't quite find it, but they found it in Mexico City. And, some people have interpreted this passage as a kind of Orientalist, to put in quotes, because it's not literally Orientalist, although he does use the word fellahin, which is a word associated with Egyptian peasants, right? An old word for Egyptian peasants. So it's not literally Orientalist, but it's using sort of you could call the third world or the developing world as a place for these wealthier white Americans. They're not wealthy, but they're wealthier, right? Using as a space for these white Americans to find, right, the transcendence they were seeking. But I think if you want a more charitable interpretation, right, because I'm not that interested in critiquing Kerouac's politics. I don't really care that much about that. I care more about the beauty and the glory of these sentences and this exhilarating reading experience. I think it's a tragedy if you think about it. Kerouac, as writer of the Beat Generation, looking around him at America in his time period in the 50s, seems to recognize this tragedy that America has lost something, right? America has lost some kind of innocence. Notice he describes Mexico City here. He describes this thing that they found as childlike. And remember that passage at the beginning. He associated Dean with childhood, with the long-lost brothers, as if he was a long-lost brother from childhood. So innocence, childhood, childlike, right? That's all important for Sal. America no longer has that. America has lost its innocence, but they can still find it here in Mexico City, right? They can still find the pearl. But now look at the very next sentence. Then I got fever and became delirious and unconscious. So he gets sick immediately, right? He finds what he's looking for. He finds the pearl and then immediately gets sick. And this is where it kind of all falls apart. And it happens relatively quickly, right? Dean basically leaves Sal after Sal gets sick, and Dean goes away. Let's look at the sort of scene at the end of this section, at the end of this chapter. Gotta get back to my life. Wish I could stay with you. Pray I can come back. I grabbed the cramps in my belly and groaned. When I looked up again, bold, noble Dean was standing with his old broken trunk and looking down at me. I didn't know who he was anymore, and he knew this and sympathized. and pulled the blanket over my shoulders. Yes, 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 I've got to go now. Old fever, Sal, goodbye. And he was gone. 12 hours later, in my sorrowful fever, I finally came to understand that he was gone. By that time, he was driving back alone through those banana mountains, this time at night. When I got better, I realized what a rat he was. But then I had to understand the impossible complexity of his life, how he had to leave me there, sick, to get on with his wives and woes. Okay, old Dean, I'll say nothing. So what a great section, right, at the end of section 4, at the end of part 4. Dean leaves him, right, while he's sick. And it's so quick and so sudden and so different from the sort of rhapsodizing lyrical sections earlier. It happens almost in a flash. You don't even realize it, and suddenly Dean is gone. And that I think is the point, right? This is not the kind of transcendent, mystical, lyrical sentences of earlier. This is back to reality. And what's interesting, though, is what does Sal say at the end? He says, I realized what a rat he was, right? He's mad at Dean. He realizes Dean is a rat, but then immediately he forgives him, right? But then I had to understand the impossible complexity of his life. He realizes, you know what? He might be a rat, but his life is complex. Remember, for Sal, Dean represents the great, noble, youthful, innocent American. Dean can do no wrong, even when he does the ultimate wrong here, leaving Sal. Okay, old Dean, I'll say nothing. Right? He sort of says to Dean implicitly that he forgives him. That's kind of what he says right at the end. Now, what's interesting, though, is that is not the end of the novel. There is one last section, part 5, which is kind of a falling action denouement almost, right? Where we sort of get back to reality almost, where Sal is kind of making one last road trip, but this is to move to San Francisco. And he's going to go meet Dean over in San Francisco. But I think the key here is that Sal and Dean's relationship, Sal and Dean's friendship is broken now, right? Is no longer recoverable. Basically, Sal meets a girl and decides to move in with her in San Francisco. And in a way, if we think about it, the novel began with Sal talking about his divorce from his wife and meeting Dean. And how does it end? It ends with Sal getting back together with someone else and Sal and Dean splitting up. And so I want to just look at the final sections where Sal sees Dean for the last time in the novel. So let's look at this section right towards the end, the last pages, basically, of the novel. So Dean couldn't ride uptown with us, and the only thing I could do was sit in the back of the Cadillac and wave at him. The bookie at the wheel also wanted nothing to do with Dean. Dean, ragged in a moth-eaten overcoat he brought specially for the freezing temperatures of the East, walked off alone, and the last I saw of him, he rounded the corner of 7th Avenue, eyes on the street ahead, and bent to it again. Poor little Laura, my baby, to whom I'd told everything about Dean, began almost to cry. Oh, we shouldn't let him go like this. What'll we do? Old Dean's gone, I thought, and out loud I said, he'll be all right. And off we went to the sad and disinclined concert for which I had no stomach, whatever, and all the time I was thinking of Dean and how he got back on the train and rode over 3,000 miles over that awful land and never knew why he had come anyway, except to see me. So, he and Dean don't get this kind of final reunion. Sal basically goes off to a concert, right, with, they're in New York at this time, right? They're not in San Francisco, they're in New York. I think it's key that they're in the East, right? They're no longer in the West. Dean, remember, is out of place in the East. This detail, it even emphasizes his ragged coat, right? His moth-eaten overcoat that he had brought specially for the freezing temperatures of the East. Dean is out of place in New York. Dean is out of place on the East. And Sal has also moved on from Dean. Sal is with a girl now. And I think it's interesting. Sal wishes he was with Dean, right? He says, I was thinking of Dean, and he's empathizing with Dean, and he's imagining Dean getting back on the train and going back west over this awful land, right, which is America. But he doesn't turn around. He doesn't go back and talk to Dean. He doesn't tell Dean, come on, let's go, let's keep traveling. It's as if implicitly Sal knows that life on the road is over, that this period of his life is over. He has moved on. He has matured. He has moved past Dean. The final paragraph then, the final paragraph of the novel. Let's look at this final paragraph and think about how Kerouac concludes all this. So in America, when the sun goes down, and I sit on the old broken down river pier, watching the long, long skies over New Jersey, and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the west coast, and all that road going, all the people dreaming in the immensity of it. And in Iowa, I know by now the children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry, and tonight the stars will be out, and don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night that blesses the earth, darkens all rivers, cups the peaks and folds the final shore in. And nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. I think of Dean Moriarty. I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father we never found. I think of Dean Moriarty. So that reference to the father we never found, right, is part of the sort of one of the subplots of the novel is they were looking for Dean's father, old Dean Moriarty. But I think it sort of implies that the father they never found is kind of what Dean represented, right, what he symbolized for America. But also just notice the way that sentence is written. It's all one long, long, long sentence. He says, I sit on the pier, watch the long skies over New Jersey, and I think about all the land, right? That's what Sal thinks about, the great land that he has traveled across, right? And he thinks about the West Coast, New Jersey. He thinks about Iowa, and he thinks of children. He thinks of children crying, looking out at the stars, right? Because again, what does childhood represent in this novel? It represents innocence. It represents American innocence. And at this point for Sal, it represents the thing that he no longer has, the thing that he has moved past. And he's looking back kind of in nostalgia, right, at this childhood innocence. And he thinks about the kind of darkness of the prairie and how it blesses the earth. It darkens the rivers. And what does he say? Nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. I think that's, again, implicitly, that's the other tragedy of the novel, is that they can't live this life on the road forever because they have to grow old. Time has to move on. Much like The Age of Innocence and some of the other novels we've looked at, this novel is also about the passage of time implicitly. And the passage of time kind of prevents them from living in that sort of ecstasy forever. So to kind of summarize then, I mean, what's so brilliant about this novel, what I think works so well here is, think about all the things we've talked about, all the passages we've read. Think of the prose, the beautiful, lyrical, evocative, long sentences that Kerouac writes, these sentences that capture a certain wildness, a certain dreamy wildness that Dean represents, that Sal is craving. And again, I think what works so well with the novel, especially about the ending, is they both find it and don't find it, right? They find it in Mexico City. They do find the pearl. They do find the thing they were seeking for at the end of the road, but they also can't find it forever, right? What they find, they cannot hold forever. They have to let it go. They have to grow old. Dean leaves Sal, and then in part 5, Sal and Dean are no longer as close as they were. So again, like so many great novels, it's not just the prose, it's not just the sort of what the novel is about, but it's the course the novel takes, the narrative that builds. People often say On the Road has no plot, that it's just them traveling all over the country. That's not true. There is clearly a plot here. There is clearly a character arc that Sal experiences. There is clearly a narrative built around Sal and Dean's friendship, the way they get closer, the way they find the transcendence, find the pearl, and then the way it falls apart, right? There is this movement throughout the novel. Sometimes when it comes to plot, I think people are too attuned to Hollywood movies, right, and contemporary movies, where stuff has to happen. But plot, as I often tell my students, plot is really character change. Plot really comes down to character arcs. If your character experiences an emotional transformation, a dynamic emotional transformation over the course of a novel, then that novel has a plot. Don't know what else to tell you, right? That is a plot. That is a narrative. That's what narratives are built on and made of. And that's what we have here. A really moving and really beautiful character arc for Sal in the context of his relationship with Dean. So let's wrap up there for On the Road. Thank you guys for listening. I hope our discussion of the novel, my discussion of the novel, really inspired you to either reread it if it was something you'd read a long time ago, or to read it for the first time if you've never read it. Like I said, right, the beauty is in the sentences, the beauty is in the text itself, so go lose yourself in Jack Kerouac's wonderful language and wonderful sentences. And as always, if you enjoyed the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends, and I'll see you all next time.